The Value of History, Chapter 20 of A Short History of the Arab Peoples by Sir John Glubb. Some knowledge of Arab history should undoubtedly form part of every educational syllabus. The principal reasons for this statement, opposed as it is to present practice among Western nations, will be set out in this chapter. The first reason may be described as continuity. History is a continuous process, and to read extracts from it, taken from here and there and separated by long periods of silence, destroys the interest of the story. The Arab Empire, which dominated the Western world for 6 centuries, was itself founded on its mighty predecessors, Rome and Persia. The rise, the greatness, and the civilization of the Arab Empire are incomprehensible without some knowledge of Greek, Persian, and Roman culture on which they were largely built. In the same manner, the rise of Christian Europe cannot be explained without some understanding of the accomplishments of Arab civilization, from which Western culture largely derived its knowledge and its early ways of thought. Thus, some acquaintance with Arab history is necessary to the comprehension of our own beginnings. Arab control of what we call the Middle East and their naval command of the Mediterranean imposed a blockade on Europe, which destroyed the commercial and urban society left behind by the Romans. During 5 centuries, from the 7th to the 12th, Europe was deprived of all overseas commerce by the long Arab barrier extending from the Atlantic to Central Asia north of Tibet. The Roman commercial connections with India and the Far East were taken over in their entirety by the Arab Empire, the ships of which plied to India, East Africa, Indonesia, and China. As a result, the Muslim countries became immensely wealthy, and their standard of living was as much in advance of that of Europe as the wealth of the West today exceeds that of the Arabs. Europe, shut off from the rest of the world, was obliged to become self-supporting and produced only its own food and homemade clothing. Cash, the product of commerce, was scarce, and gold almost unobtainable. Land became the normal form of wealth, and the barons, not the businessmen or the bankers, were the leading citizens. For more than 1,000 years after the Arab conquests of the 7th century, families which owned land were considered in Western Europe to be socially superior to persons engaged in commerce. Thus, the social consequences of the Arab blockade of Europe lasted far longer than the commercial. Even when Europe had already outstripped the Arabs economically, the social superiority of the landed gentry in the West still remained. This example gives ample proof of the necessity of continuity, if the meaning of historical and social changes is to be understood. In spite, however, of the Muslim blockade, a trickle of commerce still reached Constantinople, either from Arab territory in periods of truce, or by caravans passing north of the Caspian and Black Seas, or by means of Jewish merchants, who were able to operate in both Christian and Muslim countries. These surviving channels of trade, however slender, were sufficient to allow the Byzantines to maintain a limited urban and commercial civilization, and to enable them to escape the feudal system and the Dark Ages, which had settled upon Western Europe. If knowledge of the history of the period from the 7th to the 12th centuries is vital to the comprehension of the development of Europe, why, it may be asked, has it never been taught? Throughout these 500 years, Christendom lived in constant fear of Muslim conquest. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, Islam and Christendom were equally balanced. The West was overtaking and gradually surpassing the Muslim countries in power, principally owing to its technical improvements in firearms and shipbuilding. Not until 1498 did Vasco da Gama by discovering the Cape route, enable Europe once again to trade with India and the Far East. But throughout the Renaissance period in Europe, fear of the Muslims was still strong, and hostility, political and commercial as much as religious, was intense. Doubtless, as a result of these factors, the indebtedness of Western civilization to Arab civilization was systematically played down, if not completely denied. A tradition was built up by censorship and propaganda that the Muslim imperialists had been mere barbarians, and that the rebirth of learning in the West was derived directly from Roman and Greek sources alone, without any Arab intervention. Modern Oriental studies have proved the falsity of this historical propaganda, although the latter is still widely believed by the general public. Unfortunately, a great part of the educational world still adheres to these ancient taboos, and the period of some 5 or 6 centuries which separates the decline of Rome from the Norman invasion of England is omitted from school curricula and from public examinations. As is always the case, this falsification of history for propaganda purposes has injured ourselves more than anyone else, and has been largely responsible for the many political errors which our governments have committed in the Middle East in the last 60 years. The history of progress, the rise of man from a primitive state to his modern condition, is a fascinating story. The interest is lost, however, when the continuity is concealed by the omission of periods of several centuries and the presentation of bits and pieces of history gathered from here and there in accordance with our own emotional prejudices or our national vanity. The Arab blockade not only destroyed the material prosperity, but also the culture and learning of the West, which was reduced to poverty and ignorance, while the Arabs themselves continued to advance in knowledge and wealth. When the Muslims conquered Spain, Sicily, and southern Italy, they established in those countries their own high standards of refined living and profound scholarship. When the tide turned and Christendom reconquered Spain, the Balearics, Sicily, Italy, and Crete, these Muslim communities were the means of once more spreading science, scholarship, and culture to the West. Thus, the Arabs first destroyed the civilization of the West, and then replenished it. Were the Arabs then mere carriers who inherited the culture of Greece and Rome and then gave it back to Europe? Only partially so. They did indeed preserve the writings of the ancient Greeks and pass them on to Europe in Arabic to be translated into Latin. In addition, however, they added a greater or a lesser contribution to every form of knowledge which passed through their hands. Their most outstanding performance was probably in the field of mathematics, in which they introduced our present system of writing units, tens, hundreds, and thousands, and so on. Modern mathematics, and thus modern science, could never have been discovered if the cumbrous Roman way of writing numbers had remained in use. Having introduced those numerals, which we still call Arabic, the Arabs went on to invent logarithms, algebra, and trigonometry. In the same manner, they studied the medical writings of the Greeks and improved upon their knowledge and their methods. Arab medical treatises remained standard textbooks for students in Europe for centuries. In botany, geography, natural history, zoology, and other minor sciences, they were centuries ahead of Europe. Their manufactures were far in advance of those of the West. Their textiles, silk, embroideries, glassware, weapons, and metalwork were immensely superior to anything Europe could produce. They introduced the use and manufacture of paper to the West. Yet, in all their arts, sciences, and manufacturing skills, they inherited their knowledge. It is true that if they received 10 talents, they added to them 10 talents more. Nevertheless, these branches of knowledge had originated elsewhere and were to be inherited and yet further improved upon in Europe, after the Arab decline. They ran but one lap in the relay race of knowledge. They snatched the torch of learning from their predecessors, and when they fell, they passed it on to those who followed them. But in one direction, the Arabs made an entirely original and unique contribution to thought. They introduced Europe to romance. The fact that the word Arab covers a great many different races has already been explained. Western historians, while at times obliged to admit the extraordinary contributions to science and the arts which we owe to the Arab imperial age, sometimes point out that the intellectuals concerned were not of Arabian origin. This statement is, at least partially, true. The brilliant intellects were Syrians, perhaps of Greek descent, Persians, Indians, or Spaniards, though it is only just to give some credit to the Arabians, who had built the splendid imperial structure which housed the authors, the doctors, and the scientists. In the field of poetry and romance, however, it was the people of the Arabian Peninsula who were the innovators. The tribesmen of Arabia had always been passionate devotees of poetry, even though most of them were illiterate. Rhyming verse, unknown to the Greeks and Latins, was brought by them to Europe. More important, however, than poetical forms was the Arabian idea of honor. The desert peninsula had always been too poor to support a government, and each tribe enjoyed independence. Inevitably, the interests of different tribes sometimes clashed, giving rise to wars. But nomadic tribes had no cities, lands, or houses to be conquered. Their only property was their flocks, which could be raided, but which the owners could always raid back. Such circumstances did not make for total war. No Arab tribe wished to destroy its rivals. Waged under such conditions, wars became little more than a dangerous sport. Apart from human enemies, the great open spaces of the desert made survival difficult. The sparsity of the population meant that men were often obliged to cross wide tracts of desert alone, threatened by tribal enemies, wild beasts, hunger, and thirst. Only men of outstanding character and individuality could survive. In the crowded delta of Egypt, or the streets of a modern city, men are constantly surrounded by thousands of human beings and rarely have to act for themselves. The Bedouin, on the other hand, was completely self-reliant and ready to take a personal initiative. His principal object in war was to win honor for himself by personal acts of heroism. This ideal of personal honor had its advantages and its drawbacks, but it was entirely distinctive and peculiar to the nomads of Arabia. On the one hand, it prevented dishonorable actions, treachery, and ruthlessness. It could cause modern war with its bombing of open cities, its poison gas, and its liquid fire and napalm to be regarded with intense horror and disgust. But it made the Bedouin headstrong, hard to discipline, and lacking in communal spirit. While the Syrian, conquered by the Arabs, settled down to intellectual pursuits, the Arabian tribesmen swept on to Spain on the wave of conquest. In Andalus, he established a regime which incorporated his intense sensitivity to personal honor, his jealousy of rivals leading to frequent challenges and civil wars, and his flamboyant love of glory, romance, and poetry. His code of chivalry, retained by the Spaniards for centuries after the fall of Granada, passed over into France and to England, where it ultimately formed the basis of our codes of sport and fair play. It crossed the Atlantic with the conquistadors and permeated the thinking of New Spain. The extraordinary variety of races which constituted the Arab Empire thus enabled one group to bequeath to humanity many brilliant legacies of the intellect, while another branch spread the quixotic and romantic ideas of chivalrous love and the generous rivalry of honorable enemies. Had such ideas survived to our own times, they might have done something to refine and elevate the savage and primitive brutality of modern war. The study, even if brief and superficial, of long periods of history has also a philosophical value. The peoples of Europe and North America today believe themselves to be immensely superior to all previous nations recorded in history. This supercilious attitude inspires them with the belief that the history of the past has no lessons for them, and that a knowledge of physics or mechanics is of more practical use than a study of the vicissitudes of mankind. Physical science itself has achieved its modern spectacular advances by a basically simple method, namely the execution of a great number of experiments and the careful observation and tabulation of the results observed. When a sufficient number of accurate records has been accumulated, a theory can be formulated and eventually a law deduced. But while, by these methods, we have transformed the material conditions of our lives, we have made no progress whatever in the art of human government. Treatises on the subject written more than 2,000 years ago are in advance of many of the systems still employed today. The indifference we show towards the art of government is increasingly dangerous in proportion to the advance of physical science, which provides the discontented with ever more lethal instruments wherewith to vent their resentment on their fellow men. Perhaps never before in human history has so large a proportion of mankind been fired with so much indignation against the governments which control their own or other countries. It is remarkable that in an age claiming to be scientific, we never think of investigating the experiments in government carried out by our predecessors or the results which they obtained. In politics, we prefer to adhere to our narrow individual prejudices rather than to study the recorded conclusions of those who have done similar experiments in the past. It so happens that the Arab Empire, all knowledge of which has been systematically concealed from us, carried out a considerable number of experiments which are extremely relevant to our own situation today. It lasted at its greatest political strength for some 230 years, almost exactly the length of the life of the British Empire. It enjoyed complete command of the sea, and it earned its wealth by commerce with India and the Far East. After 200 years of power, when it appeared to be at the pinnacle of its glory, it tired of ruling distant peoples. Harun al-Rashid voluntarily gave dominion status to Ifriqiya, and his son Mamun did the same for Khorasan. When the empire commenced to break up and economic decline set in, the people did not work harder to atone for the loss of trade. On the contrary, in Baghdad, they introduced a 5-day week. A welfare state was inaugurated similar to our own, with free medical treatment, free hospitals, free university education, and government grants to students. It would appear as if, at the beginning of its period of power, an imperial race scatters all over the world, full of initiative and the love of adventure. In its later life, however, a reaction sets in and the pendulum swings to the opposite extreme. At this stage, the people become purely inward-looking. All interest in the empire is lost, and the nation's attention is focused only on its own domestic affairs. As there are still reserves of wealth which have survived from the great days, lavish expenditure is incurred on social services, on education, and on humanitarian projects. But with the decline in the national status, the accumulated wealth of the past is soon dissipated. At first, an attempt is made to maintain social expenditure by increasing taxes and devaluing the currency. But these subterfuges only increase the disease. The welfare state has to be abandoned, and an increasingly low standard of living must be accepted. Far from being a wonderful modern concept, the welfare state may well be a regular and recurrent feature of great nations in decline. Another interesting phenomenon of the Muslim Empire was the emergence of women into public life. 10th century writers in Baghdad state that women in their time had become lawyers, doctors, officials, and university professors. This also seems to have been a temporary phase, for the next stage in the national decline was a breakdown in law and order, accompanied by an increase of banditry, rioting, and political coup d'etat. Possibly the multiplication of acts of violence made it inadvisable for women any longer to go out to work unescorted and obliged them to remain at home. While the life history of the Arab Empire seems thus to bear an extraordinary resemblance to our own, the same factors are perceptible to a greater or a lesser degree in all the empires recorded in history. Our ignorance alone allows us not only to repeat the identical errors committed by our predecessors, but also loudly to proclaim as innovations the same ideas that have so often been tried out by other nations in the past. History, thoughtfully studied, can provide a touchstone which can be used to test the validity of the beliefs and the prejudices of our times. It is the fashion today, for example, to state that all races are, quote, equal. It would certainly be blasphemy for us to claim that they are not equal before God, but our ideas of equality in other respects are extremely confused. They lead us, for example, to prescribe our own political institutions, as they are today, as a panacea for the poverty of some distant nation, largely illiterate, living in the jungle thousands of miles away. To criticize such a suggestion is to draw down on oneself the supercilious remark, quote, "I believe all nations to be equal even if you do not." Many of these errors are due to neglect of the element of time, which is revealed by the study of history. Nations can, in many respects, be compared to individuals, who begin their lives in ignorance and in innocence, without strength and without possessions. Gradually they grow in experience and knowledge and in wealth, until in the prime of life they may win the loyalty and the admiration of all who know them. But all too soon they pass their peak. Physical effort becomes exhausting, mental concentration grows difficult, receptivity to new ideas is lost, and the memory begins to fail. Yet we cannot say that, as a human being, a child or an old man is of less value than a young man. In most respects, however, they cannot be said to be equal. An old man is inferior to a youth at physical exertion, but superior to him in experience or in wealth. The application of the historical time element to the different branches of the human race gives us a more realistic pattern than either the claim that all nations are equal or the converse belief that our own is superior to all others. Races, like people, are born, grow up, become strong and powerful, then weaken and waste away. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs, each in their turn grew strong, wise, brave, and cultured. Then, one after another, they became old and weak and decayed. The Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs were, at one time, as rich, as enterprising, and as civilized as Victorian Britain. Today they are leaders no longer. Britain herself, in her turn, has fallen from the high estate she but recently enjoyed. We are no more entitled today to regard the Persians, the Greeks, or the Arabs as inferior than the Americans or the Russians are to say the same of the British. Our varying capabilities are largely a matter of age. It is a sobering thought to realize that when a great nation loses its preeminence, it does not merely drop back into second or third place. In most cases, it ceases to exist as a political entity. The Greeks, for example, who led the world for some 3 centuries, lost their independence for the ensuing 2,000 years. After the fall of Rome, Italy remained only a geographical expression for 15 centuries. There may be here some factor of exhaustion. To be a leading nation for 3 or 4 centuries is no sinecure. The effort, indeed, the heavy drain imposed on the best types of citizens, and the loss of the most devoted and courageous in wars or in pioneering, leave the master race permanently impoverished. These losses may become increasingly damaging as the national decline continues and many citizens, impatient at the humiliation of their country, migrate to other states. Apart from the casualties caused by wars, pioneering, and immigration, national decadence is probably largely attributable to too long a duration of wealth and power. The nation gradually but unconsciously assumes that preeminence is automatically its due, without any obligation to toil or struggle. A surprising number of empires have endured for some 200 to 250 years. The Assyrians lasted from 860 BC to 626 BC, 230 years. The Persians from 538 BC to 330 BC, or 208 years. The Greeks, Alexander and his successors, from 330 BC to about 100 BC, 230 years. The Arabs from AD 634 to AD 861, or 227 years. The Spaniards from 1556 to 1800, 244 years. The Ottomans were a great and virile empire from the accession of Murad I in 1359 to the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566, 207 years. The British Empire may be said to have endured from 1700 to 1930, 230 years. It is not desired to insist on rigid numbers, for many outside factors influence the fates of great nations. Nevertheless, the resemblance between the lives of so many and such varied empires is extremely striking, and is obviously entirely unconnected with the development of those mechanical devices of which we are so proud. The explanation of this uniformity would appear to lie in the field of human psychology rather than of electronics. 8 or 9 generations seem to be sufficient to change the hardy and enterprising pioneers into the idle and querulous citizens of the welfare state. A further point of interest arising from the study of Arab history is the similarity between the periods of survival of the successor dynasties. The Samanids of East Persia lasted from 875 to 999, or 124 years. The Buwayhids from 945 to 1055, 110 years. The Seljuks of Persia from 1055 to 1156, the death of Sultan Sanjar, 101 years. The Ayyubids from 1169 to 1250, or 81 years. The Muwayhids from 1129 to 1214, or 85 years. In brief, the life of a dynasty, the rise of which was due to the outstanding personality of its founder, not to a national expansion, is in the vicinity of 100 years, or 4 generations. This period is about one half that required for the rise and decline of a whole nation. Interesting results might be obtained from research into the family histories of the descendants of great industrialists, merchants, and millionaires. In some cases, at least, the 3rd generation from the builder of the family fortunes seems to show the first signs of idleness and incompetence. In their case, as in that of minor Oriental dynasties, 4 generations transformed the vigorous and enterprising founder of the business into the languid and frivolous, or at least unenterprising, heir. These considerations should broaden our views and replace our arrogance by humility. How wrong we are to sneer at the Persians, the Greeks, the Italians, or the Arabs, who, one after the other, built up the structure of civilization which we inherited. Soon we ourselves will have joined them in retirement, and will have become an object of contempt to our younger successors. A further comparison with human life may be seen in the fact that, as far as our historical records go, no nation has ever been young twice. All those peoples which, throughout history, have for a time been the leaders of mankind are now in comparative weakness. We should regard them with gratitude and veneration, as we do the great men of the past, who once formed the glory of our respective countries. It may be objected, perhaps, that if no nation can be great twice, the time will come when all the races of the world are old and decadent and incapable of leadership. A closer scrutiny, however, will show us that, in fact, nations, like individuals, continually combine together to give birth to new generations of peoples. Conquests and migrations produce new mixtures and compounds, which often rapidly take the lead and present to the world fresh and original national personalities. The Arabs were themselves, in their day, an example of this process. The warlike, romantic, and poetic tribesmen of Arabia mingled with the pseudo-Greek intellectuals of Syria, the sturdy Berbers of the Atlas, and the Romans and Goths of Spain to produce original and fertile combinations. Today, the United States is the most prominent example of a new national personality born as the child of older races. Yet it would be an oversimplification to visualize the nations of the world as all alike, save that some are old and some are young. For every race, like every human being, has original and distinct characteristics and possess a number of peculiar qualities, not quite identical with any other. One may be supreme in the field of art, another may have taught mankind respect for law and order, a third is preeminently gifted with romance and imagination, or with mathematical skill or business acumen. This factor explains the necessity for regular changes of leadership, for if one race were to remain too long in supreme power, the particular qualities which it happened to possess would become overemphasized throughout humanity. Thus, for example, a paramount race which has laid particular emphasis on personal freedom may need to be followed by one which is peculiar for its insistence on authority and discipline, in order that the general balance of human growth may be preserved. Reference has already been made to those persons who claim that history has no lessons for us because former empires did not possess spacecraft, jet fighters, or other such mechanical or electronic devices. There is here a considerable confusion of thought. History teaches us lessons in human nature, which has not changed. The inhabitants of the world today are moved by the same passions of greed, cruelty, love of power, self-sacrifice, heroism, and fanaticism as were the Romans and the Arabs. It is the manner of operation of these emotions which we learn from history. The ancient Assyrian Empire lasted the same number of years as the British Empire, although the Assyrians traveled on foot and fought with spears and bows and arrows. Yet the Assyrians began as aggressive fighters and went on to acquire great wealth. The last king of Assyria was more interested in his library than in his army. Thus, the psychological and moral rise and decline of nations is the same, regardless of weapons, means of transport, or material surroundings. Later empires, owing to improvements in navigation, extended beyond the seas, but the effect of wealth and power on the thoughts and characters of the imperialists remained the same. Today, the word empire has an unpopular and old-fashioned sound. We may therefore refer to the same phenomenon as paramount nations. Subject to this change of name, the process of rise and decline seems to be unaltered. In recent times, it is true, new methods of achieving power have begun to emerge. The first of these is the power of high finance. When we are told, for example, that in the First World War, the same group of financiers was providing funds for the war efforts of the United States, Britain, Germany, and revolutionary Russia, we inevitably begin to wonder. The power wielded by a small number of financiers, however, must necessarily be secret, for if the peoples knew of it, they could destroy the money manipulators. A more obvious modern development is the power of the mass media of publicity, such as the press, television, broadcasting, the cinema, and book publishing. If a number of these media come under the influence of any group, whole nations can be brainwashed in the direction desired by the manipulators. In former ages, governments kept order by the use of armed force, with which they applied coercion to the discontented. To control the opinions of the public by influencing the media of publicity is both a less painful and, to the future of humanity, a more dangerous method. It is useless to say that intelligent people will think for themselves. Nobody can, in fact, remain unaffected by the mass information directed at them by modern publicity. But if governments can brainwash their citizens by these means, in free countries the same influence can be brought to bear secretly by large financial interests, who exercise a controlling influence over the press, the television, and the cinema. Elected governments can become helpless puppets in the hands of such concealed but powerful forces. The same secret groups can undermine the morals, destroy the patriotism, or ridicule the religion of any nation, the moral fiber of which may resist their ambitions. None of these maneuvers are really new. We have already seen that the Abbasids destroyed the Umayyads by subversive propaganda in the modern style. But if the idea of subversion is old, the modern expansion of the press, broadcasting, the cinema, and publishing have immensely increased the power of subversion and indoctrination. In brief, the motives and the psychology of mankind are unchanged and can be observed again and again in history. The heads of modern governments and the magnates of high finance are driven onwards by the same lust for power as inspired the Roman emperors or the Mongol Khakans. And once that power is achieved, it corrupts those who wield it until they weaken and collapse, and are replaced by new and more energetic seekers after wealth and domination. We are terrified in our moments of weakness at the possibility of extermination in a nuclear war. Yet the prospect of the destruction of our minds and our morals by mass brainwashing media is in a way even more alarming. Yet there are reserves of spiritual strength available to men sufficient to enable them to resist. Only by a real revival of spiritual life can these subversive machinations be defeated. These brief and inadequate remarks may have suggested something of the fascination of the study of human history, if we can so far transcend our narrow prejudices as to view these great processes impartially and as a continuous whole. To be able to consider these mighty movements as part of a vast and benevolent plan to carry forward the whole human race may even do something to ease the fear, the pain, and the despair which we tend to feel in our personal or our national humiliations. We are so busy rushing about, writes Evelyn Underhill, so immersed in what we call practical things, that we seldom pause to realize the mysterious truth of our situation, how little we know that really matters, how completely our modern knowledge leaves the depths of our existence unexplored. To some, the majesty and the harmony of these movements, like many other natural processes which we so easily take for granted, may suggest the masterly planning of the mind of God, for the manifestation of which the whole creation still groans and suffers in pain, awaiting its perfection and its deliverance from this earthly bondage.